This remarkable, stimulating, and often moving conference is coming to an end. Before we attempt to summarize our impressions of its highlights and the main conclusions which emerged within the framework of the conference's theme, What's New, What Next? Innovative Methods, New Sources, and Paradigm Shifts in Jewish Studies, let me thank those who have made possible its success. In the first place are those responsible for its organization. Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, Chief Curator of the core exhibition and advisor to the director at the museum, who was at Spiritus Movens, as was evident in the previous presentation, which we just listened to. Joanna Wojcicka-Warda, Deputy Director Jolanta Gomua, Artur Markowski, Michał Czembacz, Dagmara Mańka-Wizor, Katarzyna Peplinska, Jacek Flutz. I should like also to mention here Agnieszka Dulemba of the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, who first came up with the concept of the conference. Gridali, responsible for the technical side, did a fine job with very few glitches. We should also like to thank our partners in organizing the conference. The Institute, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, the Dubnov Institute for Jewish History and Culture, the Memorial de la Shoah, the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies at the University of Michigan, the University of Tel Aviv, Yad Vashem International Institute for Holocaust Research, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and University College London. The conference was organized within the Global Education Outreach Program of the Pauline Museum and supported by the Toby Philanthropies, the William K. Bowes Junior Foundation, and the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute. It was co-financed from the Scientific Excellence Program of the Ministry of Education and Science in Poland, and also benefited from the support of the European Association for Jewish Studies. It enjoyed the patronage of the American Association for Polish Jewish Studies, the European Association for Jewish Studies, the Institute of Jewish Studies of the Jagiellonian University, the Mordechai Anielewicz Center for Research and Teaching of the History and Culture of Jews in Poland at the University of Warsaw, the Sefer Center for the University Teaching of Jewish Civilization in Moscow, the Polish Association of Judaic Studies, the Polish Association of Yiddish Studies, and the Toby Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław. I should like also to thank all the participants, above all the core speakers and the chairs of the many sessions. I could go on, but I think that it's clear that this was a huge cooperative event, and it only is achieved the success which it did because of the cooperation of all those involved, and I'd like to conclude there by thanking them. The goal of the conference, which was very successfully done online, was to explore new directions in the study of East and Central European Jews and the place of Jewish studies in the humanities today. To discuss how far this was achieved and how these new directions should be explored in the future, we have a very distinguished panel. Let me briefly introduce the first of the speakers. Scott Uri is Senior Lecturer in Tel Aviv University, the Department of Jewish History, where he's also Director of the Eva and Mark Bazin Institute for the Study of Historical Consciousness and Senior Editor of the journal History and Memory Studies in Representation of the Past. His monograph, Barricades and Banners, The Revolution of 1905 and the Transformation of Warsaw Jewry, was awarded the Reginald Selnick Prize for Outstanding Book in the Field of History by ASIS in 2013. He's also the editor of Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism. I'll ask him and the other two panelists to address the two questions posed by the conference. In the first place, what is the place of Jewish studies in the humanities today? Secondly, what are the new directions in the study of the Jews of Eastern Central Europe that need to be explored. I suggest that you each speak for 10 minutes, and then we can discuss the issues raised. So I'll ask Scott to speak first. Scott.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Pleasure to be on this panel with Dariush and Geneviève. You can hear me? At least the people on my Zoom can hear me? Great. So here goes. We're still standing, or at least sitting, after 5 wonderful days. God save the scholar foolish enough to agree to take part in a concluding panel of a program as rich and dynamic as the one flawlessly organized by the staff at the Polin Museum under the leadership of Barbara, Arthur, Anthony, Michal Trembach, and other members of the academic committee. With dozens of panel participants, daily plenary sessions, and an array of absolutely phenomenal posters by graduate students across our globe, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to draw any sound conclusions about the state of Polish Jewish studies today. And yet, that said, let me prove how foolish I often am by offering here today a few, albeit tentative, observations regarding this week's fantastic program and its implications regarding the state of the field. So first, which field? So despite the admirable and noble goals of the conference organizers, including myself, one of the committee members, the program itself was far less about what's new in Jewish studies and a lot more about what's new in Polish Jewish studies. Or perhaps, to sharpen this concept in wake of Marzena's comments yesterday, the study of Polish Jewry. Looking back over the past few days, the picture, the composite that emerges is not only that of a vibrant and dynamic and diverse field, but one that has, as Natalia Lekshun noted yesterday, changed, or perhaps, to refer to a recent book on Israel, shifted or moved. This shift in the study of Polish Jewry becomes particularly apparent when we compare many of the topics discussed this week, so brilliantly by so many speakers, to those addressed by earlier generations of scholars who many of us studied with and learned from in graduate school, etc. As many here know, earlier generations of scholars tended to focus on a distinct set of core themes that together defined and shaped the study of modern Jewish history in Poland and other European lands, particularly Germanic lands, as Nancy Sinkoff has noted. Thus, scholars of the Jewish community, Hakila, Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, Jewish non-Jewish relations, and assimilation regularly found themselves turning to canonical works by a man of short stature, but much academic presence, Jakob Katz. And those who studied anti-Semitism, nationalism, or Zionism often found inspiration in the works of his colleague, at times nemesis, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Shmuel Ettinger. Taken together, these and other studies written in Jerusalem and other locations forged a specific discourse on modern Jewish history across the European continent, from France to Russia, that was repeatedly grounded in core concepts like community, secularization, enlightenment, assimilation, anti-Semitism, and Zionism. As the Jews, as one book, I believe from 1987, noted, moved towards modernity. I believe it was a book edited by Katz himself. The academic discourse that emerges from this week's conference, however, is radically different from the one that framed the study of modern Jewish history and society for decades. Not only are the traditional themes no longer dominant, but they no longer define the study of Polish Jewry. Instead, we had the pleasure of hearing about a number of fascinating new topics, which I believe Geneviève and perhaps Dariush will talk about further at length, that were simply not on the scholarly agenda a generation ago. They didn't exist. Topics such as the visual turn, the spatial turn, the cultural turn, and the material turn, as well as projects on key themes in the humanities like gender, memory, and race. An entire slew of new topics, which certainly didn't exist a decade ago, certainly not a generation ago, and they complement, if not transcend, traditional topics. In fact, I think it's fair to say, I'm going to say anyways, that there are far more visual sources analyzed this week than traditional Jewish rabbinic texts. Far more women were discussed and addressed than rabbis, and we heard much more about the memory of the Holocaust than the actual events of the Holocaust itself, as was noted by my colleague, Javi Dreyfus. Over the past week, I believe, we witnessed the shift or the movement of the discourse in Polish Jewish studies from a traditional interpretation heavily influenced by Katz and other Jerusalem scholars, and here I'm directly referring to David Myers of UCLA, to one that is in conversation with various aspects of cultural studies and other recent developments in the humanities. In fact, for many of those who presented, Katz and his Jerusalem colleagues were simply no longer relevant. Okay? While there are many factors at play here, a large part of this changing, shifting academic scholarly agenda and discourse can be, I believe, found in the critical role played by the museum itself. And although I have long maintained or believed or thought with myself, I never told this to anyone, that the museum's creation changed the very nature of the field in Poland, after this week's program, it has become clear, at least to me, so it's clear to me, I don't know what people think, that the museum and its many initiatives over the past, 5 to 10 years have in fact contributed to a major shift, or a large shift in the global education outreach, global discourse regarding the study of Polish Jewry. The museum, of course, even under its brilliant direction by Dariusz for the first 5 years, does not exist in a vacuum. And this week's program also highlighted the growth and maturation of Jewish studies in Poland over the past 32 years since November 1989. The sheer number of participants based or raised in Poland and the topics they discussed demonstrate the degree to which the field's composition and agenda have been transformed by the rise of a distinct, autonomous center for the study, or centers for the study of Polish Jewry in Poland, one with its own set of homegrown scholars, perhaps even 2 generations of homegrown scholars, skills and interests. Right? So of course, no conference, however amazing and wonderful, does a field make. And one noticeable lacuna in this week's program was the distinct lack of scholars and graduate students based at Israeli universities, who, for whatever reason, chose not to take part. As a result, many of the topics central to the study of Polish Jewry in Israeli academia and in Hebrew, Kabbalah, Hasidism, Zionism, Hebrew literature, the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, were relatively muted in this week's program. They were certainly not dominant, and they're certainly not as dominant as they were in the past. While this absence can easily be dismissed by the wave of a hand and claims that linguistic or cultural or personal factors were involved, I believe it points to a larger problem, namely the lack of genuine, ongoing interaction and exchange between many students and scholars in the 3 major centers for the study of Polish Jewry: Israel, Poland, and North America, as well as smaller centers like Germany, the UK, etc. Right? I could go on, Sweden, Australia, you get the picture. Like the Polish Jews that we purport to study, we remain simultaneously united and divided. So one way looking forward to address these ongoing, deeply grounded, or these ongoing structural, intellectual, and scholarly divides would be and could be the creation of academic projects and frameworks that are truly international in their organization and composition. This has been noted by several participants, Marcin, Javi, Natalia, and others. Only through travel and exchanges can students from different locations truly study foreign languages, familiarize themselves with secondary literature, and gain exposure to academic discourses and archival collections in different countries. And we even heard about this in Camille's talk of an hour or 2 ago. Perhaps then, what we need is the creation of a cooperative international program and framework that will help transform the field of Polish Jewish studies from an international community of scholars who periodically meet in, albeit wonderful, conferences, to one that will be far better prepared to meet and respond to the many challenges that await us as we turn our historians' gaze away from the past, even momentarily, towards the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's very stimulating beginning to our discussion. The second presenter in this panel is Dariusz Stolar. Of course, he's very well known to everybody. From 2014 to 2019, he was director of the Polin Museum, and he's a professor at the Institute of Political Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He's a prolific author, and among his books are Nadzieja i Zagłada, Hope and Genocide, an account of the activities of Ignacy Schwarzbart. I have to say that I helped facilitate this book because I introduced Darek to Ignacy Schwarzbart's secretary, who lived in London, the late Felek Scharf, one of the pioneers of Polish Jewish studies. He's written Kampania antysionistyczna w Polsce 1977-78, the anti-Zionist campaign in Poland 1967-68, and Kraj bez wyjścia, Migracje z Polski 1938-89, A Country with No Way Out, Migrations from Poland 1948 to 1989. For his merits in the field of the study of contemporary history, he was awarded the Order of Polonia Restituta. And I'm very interested to hear how he reacted to this conference, because unlike Scott, but like myself, he came into this field of Polish Jewish studies as a Polish historian.
Thank you very much, Anthony. First, I have noted when preparing this presentation that while we all have participated now in quite a number of online conferences in the last year and a half, the methodology of analyzing them still remains to be developed. That means I have summarized a couple of conferences in the pre-COVID era, and I was trying to do the same now, and I realized there is a difference. There are plenty of things that in old-fashioned conference we are learning, such as what is the reaction of the audience, what is the body language of the speakers. And here, when we are reduced to the screens, some things are much more difficult. And of course, the fact that we have had parallel sessions in the separate rooms was the same problems as at any major conference with parallel sessions. It was easier to switch between sessions and listen to the fragment of papers. But as I have said, summarizing it, it will take us maybe a few years of COVID more to develop a proper perspective. God forbid this happens. So first, we have had a number of excellent discussions on the topic that Anthony asked us to respond to, namely, what is the state of the art and what is the likely future of the Jewish studies, including two fantastic keynotes and the discussions that followed by Javi Dreyfus and Marcin Wodziński. And actually, because I wanted to be parochial, I don't have much choice but to remain parochial and have a Polish perspective on Polish Jewish studies. I make a virtue out of necessity. I realized that Marcin Wodziński, he has actually made a very solid research and provided data and so on. So the only thing I can do on the topic is to make a follow-up on what he said. I hope that many of you have listened to his presentation and the discussion that followed. And let me give a historian perspective, because I have realized that Polish Jewish studies in Poland have a history now. That means the new Polish Jewish studies, that Polish Jewish studies that have emerged since late 1980s. We can roughly divide the history of Jewish studies in Poland, of course, the pre-Holocaust Jewish studies in Poland of the Great Polish Jewry. But then in the communist period up to 1968, there was a substantial Jewish studies. And then the bleakest period between 68 and sometime in the early 1980s, probably a milestone was the moment when for the first time lectures on history and culture of Jews were introduced at the Jagiellonian University. As far as I remember, that was 1984 or 1985. So let's assume that was the turning point. So it's been already 35 years ago. That makes a history. And this history can explain the moment we are in, the state of the art at present. Namely, now we can see the consequences of a few decades of very intensive work and expansion of Jewish studies in Poland. For example, people who were young and promising scholars in early 1990s are professors now. people like Marcin Wodziński himself or Barbara Engelking, who hasn't been here. So they were young people fascinated with the Jewish history in Poland, and now they lead institutions. And I have given these two persons as example exactly because they had institutions. We have seen an institutionalization of the Jewish studies in Poland, which is important. And that will be also important for my next point about the future, namely, can we expect any consequences of the backlash against these Jewish studies in Poland, which we have seen in the past decade, and especially in the last 6 years of the populist government that we have had in Poland. So there is a history of it. And if we can expand this historical thinking into the near future, of course, if what we have now is the consequence of what younger people were studying in the 1990s, and I stress that we can explain the present much more with the so-called transformation period, 1990s, early 2000, than with the communist period. Clearly, the transformation period is now history. We no longer explain the present with the communist period. We now explain it with what happened in Poland after 1989. Although in Jewish studies, the transformation period started already in the 1980s. I would like to stress it. So, for example, the argument that the future of the Jewish studies in Poland largely depend on the topic of dissertations under preparation now, which is quite obvious. But let me add an important footnote to it. Namely, a feature of the contemporary Jewish studies in Poland is the transnational character. They are very transnational. This is one of the most internationalized part of historiography in Poland, certainly, which was an important asset until recently, because we had a kind of technocratic way of evaluating scholarly production, which very much was favoring international production, such as citation in foreign journals and publication with foreign publishers. Now it's no longer. We have a Minister of Science and Education, which is proud of his parochialism and want to punish those who publish abroad. So as a consequence, even if we have doctoral students making research on some aspect of Jewish history in Poland, they may just go abroad. I don't know many foreign scholars coming to teach in Poland, especially at the doctoral level, but I know a number of people who have left Poland to work abroad. So the interest of the contemporary doctoral students does not determine anymore the future of the Jewish studies in Poland, because it became transnational. Second, the question of the backlash. I'm using the term which was introduced into Polish by Mr. Forecki in his excellent book about the debates on the Holocaust in Poland. That was something that was brewing up already in the early 2000s, but clearly became much more powerful in the last 6 years under the populist government, because it got government's backup. It's government funded, it's supported by important politicians. So we have seen a certain discussion here again. I know that Geneviève is quite pessimistic about it. But we have heard Marcin Wodziński saying that he has not noted any shift in topics of research. I'm rather with Geneviève. That means I believe that there is a chilling effect on some aspect of the Jewish studies in Poland. And the essence of the chilling effect, you cannot see it. These are the topics of the unwritten books, research projects that were not launched, topics that were avoided. Moreover, we will see the effects in a few years from now. So I'm afraid it is already happening. And second, there is an important institutional component to the change in the last years, namely the establishment of parallel quasi-academic institutions, such as the Pilecki Institute, or, for example, there is a journal, Polish Jewish Studies, published by the Institute of National Remembrance. You may not know it because you have never seen any of the members of the board speaking at a major conference, although maybe one, yes, you may have seen one. So you have a kind of a parallel like shadow academia being developed. The question is how much effective it will be in undermining the present elite. But I am a little bit pessimistic about it. The chilling effect is already there. However, there may be a positive aspect, and I'm a little bit ironic, but I have a little hope. Namely, I share the opinion of some of my colleagues that the Jewish studies in Poland are massively focusing on Holocaust and the 20th century in general. There is very little research done on the medieval history, early modern history, a little bit better for the 19th century history, but clearly 20th century and the Holocaust dominates. And if we speak about the post-war period, it's very much about the memory of the Holocaust, memory and representation of the Holocaust. So maybe the fact that these topics became politically sensitive will make some people switch to less politically dangerous but equally interesting topics of the 19th or 17th century. Let's hope it. And speaking about the future, we have seen a number of turns being mentioned here, especially a fascinating session on digital humanities and the prospects it may have. But let me mention also the spatial turn, corporal turn, and so on and so on. We are yet to see the consequences of these turns in Polish Jewish studies. I haven't seen them yet. We will see how productive, how fruitful they are, but at least they open new perspectives. And here, let me respond to Scott. I suppose that these turns, they don't necessarily change the topics. We may find new answers or new perspectives to investigate the topics of the old school. Maybe we will challenge them, maybe the new scholars will challenge them, maybe not, maybe they will confirm them, but they offer an opportunity to look from new perspectives on these topics. Speaking about the great digital future, I'm fascinated the capacity of these new instruments, and especially as a historian of the communist period. Communist regimes were bureaucratic police states, massively producing relatively standardized documents. For example, the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland has 60 kilometers of passport files. And because 90% of Polish Jews emigrated after the war, and except those who left in the early post-war period, 1946, after the Kielce pogrom, those who emigrated later had to fill these questionnaires. We have thousands and thousands of documents which are waiting for digital analysis. With this new machine learning, new instruments that will allow us to analyze this mass of documents, and I'm really looking forward to see these consequences. However, what I like, especially in these new turns or new perspectives, is that many of them are turning our attention to sources that were not intended as source of information for future generations. That means mainstream historiography so far has been focusing on official reports, memoirs, printed press. That means documents that were intended to convey some information. But now we can massively use data about bodies, about kitchen recipes, about location of residents and movements, which are different nature. And this is, I think, a perfect opportunity to question again some old topics or possibly challenge them. And I will give you one small example. I was listening to a fantastic paper at this conference about Jewish immigrants to Stockholm, Sweden, immigrants from Eastern Europe, which proved that the opinion that these Ostjuden, especially Orthodox Jews coming from Eastern Europe, were spatially isolated and concentrated is not true. That there were Christian kids running into the prayer room of Orthodox Polish Jews. So I really think there is a potential. And second, there is also a potential in microhistory. Microhistory was coming again and again at this conference. And just at one session, there were fantastic papers on Tarnów and another one by Kamil Kijek, who has recently written on Dzierżoniów. So microhistory is asking big questions in small places. Again, we can ask old questions or we can ask new questions. Let me mention also Buchacz, presented by Omar Bartov in his book on the Holocaust in Galicia. So I see it as an opportunity to test the conclusion of the mainstream history using small places and asking new questions brought by these new terms. Thank you very much.
No, well, thank you again. A very stimulating and wide-ranging review of what we experienced over the last 5 days. The final presenter is Geneviève Zubzitsky. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan and director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. Among her books are The Crosses of Auschwitz, Nationalism and Religion in Post-Communist Poland, and Beheading the Saint, Nationalism, Religion and Secularism in Quebec, something which clearly has, that process which clearly has great relevance to Poland. She's now working on a new project, Resurrecting the Jew, Philo-Semitism, and the Politics of Memory in Contemporary Poland. Her books and articles have received prizes from the American Sociological Association, the International Society for the Sociology of Religion, Society for Scientific Study of Religion, the Canadian Sociological Association, and the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, and the Polish Studies Association. So she was named in 2021 as a Guggenheim Fellow for her prior achievements and exceptional promise. So Geneviève, I'd like now to hear your reaction to the proceedings of the last 5 days.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for the introduction, and to my colleagues for their stimulating comments. Jewish studies scholars are clearly au courant of all recent and not so recent trends of the humanities and social sciences. And Scott and Dariusz named a few of the terms. Here's a list of some of them that I noted during the conference. So the digital humanities turn, the material turn, the corporeal turn, the visual turn, the performative turn, the oceanic turn, trans-regional and transnational turns, the archival turns, geospatial turn, post-colonial turn, and the public historical turn. So there's a lot of turns, and then the question of where we're going is actually an important one. So the field is theoretically informed and empirically rich, as we saw in the various presentations throughout these last 5 days. And it has plenty of active senior scholars, so really experience with longue durée look at the field, and a very dynamic set of ambitious junior scholars. So if we judge by only these criteria, the field is in good shape. My brief remarks will focus on some of these terms, but before doing so, I'd like to say a few words about Jewish studies more generally. Several keynotes, those of François Guéné, Javi Dreyfus, and Martin Wojcinski, for example, and the discussions they generated, tackled the issue of Jewish studies' ontological status, whether it should be defined as ethnic studies, area studies, or religious studies, for example, noting that specific institutional arrangements, that is, in which departments or centers Jewish studies are housed at universities, shape what and how we teach, and also shape what questions we conduct research on. Related to this issue, what place Holocaust studies should have or should not have in Jewish studies. Very interesting live exchanges between Natalia Arleksian and Martin Wojcinski, for example. And a lot of interesting exchanges in chat rooms on that topic as well at that specific keynote, but also throughout the conference. And I found that such epistemological discussions happened throughout the conference, which shows an impressive level actually of disciplinary introspection and self-criticism, which also shows really that the field is a vibrant one. The research showcased on panels and discussions and debates that animated different cyber rooms in the last several days demonstrate the extent to which borders between disciplines are porous, with scholars boldly borrowing methodological and theoretical insights from various fields to shed light on their specific Jewish object of study. I must say that I was struck by the prevalence of history and the relative absence of sociology, political science, and even anthropology. So Scott was thinking, oh, the focus is really on Polish Jewish. Well, I found that the focus was really on history. It may be the result of self-selection, a result of who applied to be included in the conference, or the organizer's selection biases, and I'd be also to be blamed for that. But if the conference is representative of the field does seem to be dominated by historians. Does it matter? So that's a question for us to think about. What does that mean to have Jewish studies really primarily constituted by historians? What would Jewish studies gain by recruiting more political scientists, sociologists, economists, or social psychologists? And now I want to say a few words about those various twists and turns, roadblocks, and the road ahead. So if the conference were the Emmys or the Oscars, we'd say that the digital humanities won the night. The digital humanities turn appears to have provided technical and methodological innovations that have opened the most and the broadest avenues for future research. And as Dariusz just said, it's also shaping present research on older topics. That is, people revisiting older sources or older themes, but with new tools. Gerben Zaagsma's keynote presented us with an especially rich area of applications made possible by digital humanities. But his takeaway point really was that DH, as it is called apparently, helps us ask different questions. And several scholars demonstrated the usefulness of the digital turn in their research. So for example, on music, on mapping social networks, or as an educational tool. Zaagsma and Michel Margolis-Chesner, who moderated the discussion, were, however, quick to know that while these new technologies open broad avenues for research and its dissemination, there are important roadblocks. Not everyone has either the tools, the skills, or access to the final products that digital humanities actually open. And here again, I found the discussion of challenges to the democratization of knowledge incredibly insightful and useful well beyond Jewish studies. A close runner-up is a cluster of terms that often overlap in scholarship: the material, corporeal, and performative terms. And here the visual and the material terms also are a common pair. These literatures inspired scholars to take either a close look at new types of sources or a fresh look at known sources, some from cookbooks to musical scores to architectural plans to domestic interiors, revealing different ways of being, acting, and feeling of Jewish individuals and groups in the immediate environment and the diverse social and political context they inhabited or inhabit. Perhaps more politically cutting edge is the import of the post-colonial turn and renewed attention to intersectionality, the focus on hybrid, fluid, contested identities, and Jews' different cultural, social, religious locations, which often intersected or intersect, but also sometimes compete in conflict. The post-colonial framework and even critical race theory, some suggested, could provide new tools to think about the lives of Jews in different national contexts, past and present, and to understand power relations between Jews and Gentiles in Europe, or Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in the Middle East, or between Jews and Palestinians in the Israeli context. And then there's Poland's own Jewish turn, to which both Scott and Yuri alluded to. The fact that this conference, international conference, is organized by the Polin Museum is in itself significant. And the field of Polish Jewish studies has known an impressive boom in the last quarter century. It is not without facing important challenges, however, and that brings me to conclude with a very different type of turn, namely Poland's sharp turn to the right and its impact on historical knowledge and public debates. That turn is having a weighty impact on scholars, and everyone is aware, and we've been following with great interest and worry the case of Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking in the last several months. But it's also having, I believe, as Dariusz just said, an impact on scholarship. If established scholars like Grabowski and Engelking and Jan Gros before them fall victim to legal harassment and face legal actions, who among the next generation of historians will be brave enough to sign up for Holocaust research? As funding for research and publications in Europe is primarily allocated by the state, then the state can effectively censor research at its very roots by denying grant applications on topics it deems inconvenient. Journals and publishing houses in Europe also benefit from state subsidies. So that means that they might hesitate to publish works on the Holocaust or anti-Semitism, as they could have much to lose by publishing works considered blasphemous to the honor of the Polish nation. If Marcin Wojciński is the youngest generation, generally tends to be risk averse as opposed to previous generation, what is the future of Holocaust research in Poland? The government's problematic ideological reach into academia is not restricted to Holocaust studies, however. Social psychologist Michał Bilewicz, who studies anti-Semitic attitudes in contemporary Poland, has also become a target and was refused a full professorship. Scholars who study gender and anything related to LGBTQ studies find obtaining grants increasingly difficult. And this is where philanthropy comes in. And there was a very interesting panel moderated by Dariusz on that topic. And this is also where European funding agencies and academic institutions in Europe, North America, and Israel, this is something that Scott also you mentioned in your remarks, have an important role to play. We must assist Polish scholars in any way we can to make it possible for them to pursue their important work. That means concretely opening grants to them regardless of citizenship or immigration status. That means offering research stays and postdocs. It means providing training for publishing in English and recruiting articles and books for those of us who sit on editorial boards of journals and academic presses. So while the future of Jewish studies is bright, I'm afraid that the future of Polish Jewish studies might be bleak, and that we need to be mindful of that in how we construct future conferences to make sure that we include those scholars and we provide them with the support. And I want to say something about basically the political context in Poland is really impacting in ways small and large what's going on in different fields. And this is page A8 of the New York Times this morning, a full page devoted to Polish issues, one about the situation, treatment of refugees on the Belarus border, and the other one about 9 barracks at Auschwitz-Birkenau that were tagged with anti-Semitic slurs by vandals. And just earlier today, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal ruled that EU law is inconsistent with the Polish constitution. So these are political trends that actually have real life impact on academic life and life outside academia that we think we should also consider in our, in how we build our scholarship.
Thank you again. This was again a very well considered and thoughtful approach to the problems. I appeal to the audience to pose questions on the chat facility, because I would like to hear how the audience as a whole responds to this. Let me, while waiting for questions perhaps from the floor, try and sum up what I think are some of the issues which were raised and then go back to the panel and see how they respond. Scott raised the question of how far there is a divide between the sort of scholarship which is being pursued on Jewish and Polish Jewish topics in Israel, North America, and Poland, if I can speak pro domo suo, I mean, we've always tried in Poland to overcome these barriers. And I think that, I mean, we've had volumes on Jewish religious life, on Hasidism, on Zionism, and so on. And I think that we need to continue this. And here I would underline what Dariusz said, which is that it's a problem now for our Polish contributors that we are not recognized by the Polish Ministry of Education as one of the publications which is given credit when people are assessed for pay rises and promotions. We've been trying to deal with this, but we haven't so far succeeded. And of course, I think that there may be some aspect of this which has a political side. Secondly, Dariusz talked about what was achieved over the last 35 years in Polish Jewish history. A lot of that actually was not on the Second World War. It was on the earlier periods. And I think that he's right that we want to build on those earlier periods, because if we reduce the study of the Polish Jewish past to the Holocaust, it's like the story of the man in Ireland who stopped and asked a passerby how he got from there to Dublin. And the response was, if I wanted to get to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. If one wants to advance a degree of understanding between the more self-critical and the more apologetic camps in Polish historiography and Polish Jewish historiography, the Holocaust is not the place to start. I'm not saying that we should avoid it, but I just make this point. Thirdly, there is the question of new methods, and I think that these came up very much in the discussion. And what was very striking to me was the importance of the museum perspective. So many of the really stimulating discussions were about the visual approach to history, performative approaches to history, the history of architecture, but there were also others, the digital turn and the turn to local history, and there weren't too many on genders, but this, I mean, Scott talked about this, but this was an issue. Finally, we are all confronted with the rise of populism. And I would stress that this is not only a Polish problem, it's also a North American problem, and it's also an Israeli problem, and it creates problems everywhere. There was a very stimulating discussion on memory, which concentrated above all on the Nakba law rather than what was happening in Poland. And I think that was salutary to those of us who are concentrated on Poland. We do face an attack on scholarly history. And it's unfortunately the case that there is no reverse Gresham's law in history. You'll remember that Gresham's law said that bad money drives out good. And it does seem that bad history, whether on the internet or on the social media or promoted by various institutions, does tend to drive out good. But this doesn't mean that in the long run, there is a reverse Gresham's law. And we need to cooperate on a transnational basis, as Geneviève pointed out, to advance this. I've gone beyond the obligation, the responsibilities of the chair and spoken more than I intended, but I'll ask you to comment on what I've had to say, and perhaps we'll start again with Scott and then go to Dariusz and then finish with Geneviève. Scott.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony, and also to Dariusz and Geneviève. I think that it's interesting because we see these political issues rising, certainly in Poland. I would say also in Israel, though is really not discussed at this conference, which is another interesting point. Perhaps in the States as well. And this point was made, I forget by whom, but they're really mostly affecting 20th century modern scholars, people looking at the Holocaust, people looking at genocide. People who are comfortably ensconced in the 19th century, as I mostly am, with urbanization and the rise of modern Jewish politics, are not high on the radar of the Peace Party. So I wonder the extent to which, again, this talking about the political issues also kind of warps us into the late, or at least the second half of the 20th century, and overlooks these parts of the field that we acknowledge we are overlooking as a larger group of scholars. And that's one thing certainly to take into account. Another thing, and I enjoyed very much Geneviève's ideas and thoughts, I think, again, the turn to international cooperation among scholars in different centers and different locations is a way to kind of go around and kind of buttress these political attacks, assuming that they won't be too overwhelming. If they get so overwhelming that, again, we see an exodus of scholars from Poland, God forbid, well, that's a whole other issue. That no conference is going to stop, right? But I think, again, these thoughts that Geneviève had about ways that we can help scholars in Poland, and also coupled with what I think is really more of, and Anthony's right, Pauline has done obviously a fantastic job of the past 35 years, Anthony. I don't know how you do it year in, year out, of creating this forum. And there's clearly a book that needs to be written about Pauline's place as a journal in the creation of Polish Jewish studies. Well, okay, I believe that maybe an article or two, but it's different that a journal, as good as it is, or an annual as good as it is not an ongoing, vibrant, living exchange of scholars and people. It just isn't.
Yeah, Dariusz. You're muted.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I have realized that usually at this moment of conferences, you focus on some methodological, intellectual problem, the selection of topics for research or selection of research perspectives. And we have heard something which is very pertinent, and I share it largely, Geneviève's call for action. And this is true because academia is not just in footnotes of the articles. These are the institutions, this is funding, this is career prospects, and this is legal harassment sometimes. So these are as important for the future of Jewish studies as the new methodologies or new digital instruments for research. What will be the political, social, and economic conditions of making this research in the near future? And the conditions which were favorable, more favorable probably than for the rest of historiography or humanities in Poland in the 1990s and early 2000s, are no longer. Although, as I said, it remains to be tested, to be seen to what extent this will affect the decisions of the young people who now start the doctoral research or consider these questions. We will see it in 10 years maybe or later. In any case, I agree that we have something that worked in the 1980s, worked in the 1990s, and will work now, and this is solidarity.
Yes.
And I don't mean the big S solidarity, the trade union with the headquarters in Gdańsk, but the small S solidarity that means scholars working together across national and ethnic boundaries, which was the foundation. I believe that was the foundation of the great debates on, for example, the great Polish debates on the Holocaust, which followed the debates among scholars in the beginning in the mid 1980s. And by the way, Anthony played a key role in this debate. So let's just continue. Second, I also would like to join Scott in his praise of Pauline, the Journal of Polish Jewish Studies. But the question is, what is the new medium? What is the new forum for the Polish Jewish studies of the future? Is Pauline the forum for 2020s and 2030s, as it has been for 1990s and early 2000s, clearly? I don't know, maybe it is. This is the question to our younger colleagues. Where are you looking for information when you start to discuss something? Do you really publish an article with a journal which appears a few times a year, or you go to Facebook, maybe? So this is a question of the vehicle of our discussion. And finally, speaking about the old and the new questions and the various disciplines we can get involved. Yes, this is true. I'm a historian, so I haven't noticed the missing sociologists and political scientists in these virtual rooms. Again, thank you, Geneviève, for this note. We need them, because otherwise, well, much of these new turns or perspectives, if these were turns, it would be a slalom. You know, we couldn't go. Almost all of these turns have their roots outside of history, in anthropology, in sociology, and elsewhere. So we need at least to listen to them and possibly to deliberately to invite them. I'm not for having a quota of social scientists and anthropologists at the next conference by the Pauline Museum, but clearly considering any future conference or a collective volume, we should think about people outside of regular historiography. Thank you.
Before I ask Geneviève to comment, I want to read one of the questions, which is from Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett. And she says, I'm struck by Geneviève Zubzitsky's insight about the absence of the social sciences. As I noted during other panels, Jewish studies is dominated by a few disciplines. Interesting question as to why, the reasons lying no doubt in the history of the field, a path dependency, the central role of two omnibus disciplines, history and philology. So the social sciences, and for that matter, the arts, music, art, architecture, and so on, are marginal to Jewish studies, while Jews are marginal to those disciplines. Dariusz, you already commented on this. Geneviève, do you want to say something on this?
Yes, thank you. Dariusz, I'll be your token sociologist anytime. So please invite me to the conferences. I'll be happy to do this. I think that the place of the social sciences, and especially sociology and political science, has to do also with how those disciplines conceive of themselves. Sociology, especially in North America, is a positive science, right? So the aspirations to nomothetic and synthetic knowledge, so you're supposed to advance general laws, generalizable knowledge. So when you focus on cases that are not of the society you live and work, it's considered really less relevant. This is why a lot of sociologists who work on, let's say, Poland also have to do comparative work, right? So in order to really extract knowledge that is considered valuable for any case. So I think that's one reason. There's an elective affinity between history and area studies, not just for Jewish studies, but for, Russian and Eastern European studies, for example, of course. But there's also basically a problem within political science and history and sociology that makes the work of people like me less valuable in the eyes of American sociology, for example. Anthropology doesn't have that same, their business, their bread and butter is to study other societies, and that's legitimate. So I think that probably answers some of that question that Barbara asked. But I think that actually social scientists have much to contribute, especially since they have some of the tools, methodological tools, that are imported into area studies and Jewish studies. So that's my response to that question. I want to go back to this issue of, perhaps the political sensitivity around the Holocaust in Poland might have a good effect because people will study other, we'll go back to medieval period or other. But actually, it's history has a very important social public role. And Poland is really one of those turns, or if you can think in the periodization that you offered, Dariusz, from a sociological point of view, I would make it, there's a big before Jan Gross's Neighbors and after. And that's a very important demarcation in the Polish memory of the Holocaust and discussions about this and the creation of IPN and the backlash, and the rise to power of peace is also in relationship to this self-examination that's been going on. So the role of historians is not just to be in the library and writing, it's also about education, it's about self-knowledge about one's own society. And I think it becomes important, it would be very sad actually to retreat from that. And what Scott noted about the prevalence of Polish historians and Polish Jewish studies is also because a lot of the sources are in Polish and they're in Poland. And the micro-histories that are being conducted now are extremely fruitful and important for Jewish studies at large. So Marcin asked me in the chat also, how can we help young people to join Jewish studies in the BA? Well, perhaps those debates actually can help them, or perhaps they can go into sociology, political science, and anthropology and get to it that way, but we need to support them so that they can choose topics without being afraid. And my multiple institutional hats I wear at the University of Michigan, I try to recruit those students. I try to recruit scholars to come and offer them actually research stays, because I think that's very important, that they be able to have an environment where they can conduct the research and also disseminate the research.
Well, this is a very good point where we could gradually bring this discussion to an end. Unfortunately, our time is not unlimited. I think that we all need to work together. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, póki my żyjemy. I would just like to ask Dariusz and Scott to add to what Geneviève has said. What can we do to preserve the scholarly nature of our discipline and to encourage those who want to go into it? I'll ask Scott first and Dariusz second.
Well, I'm just wondering, I mean, maybe Dariusz and Anthony are the best suited to answer this question, but hasn't Jewish studies in Poland always had a political bent or agenda since the 1980s into the 90s up until today? It's always kind of been a resistance kind of movement. And here it kind of matches a little bit what Geneviève said about the way sociology views itself in America, dealing with race and gender and righting the wrongs of the past. And so I think this is the way really to, at least in my mind, to continue to portray it. Of course, Jewish studies becomes very different, and Jeff Weidinger noted this in one of the panels as well, in the States, where it's about identity construction, or about searching for identities, or in Israel, it's no longer part of the opposition, it's part of the dominant culture. So we see again in each of these three major centers, this political questions, they flip and they change. And so then the question of approach and appeal to younger students is also a different question, Anthony. I frankly have no idea how to attract younger students to Jewish studies. They either come or they don't come. But I think that one quick thing that might add to it is something that creating these kind of international projects and programs, which will offer a student a semester at Michigan, a semester in Warsaw, a semester in Tel Aviv, and not just kind of a dispersed kind of program, but something united and a collective, which kind of creates an ongoing program where people are traveling as cadres from place to place over a number of years.
Dariusz, you have the last word.
Oh, thank you very much. Actually, it's a great idea to make students move to three of those places, maybe also a fourth one. But when we are moving in this triangle, Poland, Israel, and North America, I think it's a great idea to move personally and at least virtually. We have online seminars with students coming from various institutions on three continents. When Geneviève was speaking about the tension between social sciences and the Jewish studies and other ethnic studies that have a tendency for history, like Polish studies of Polish diaspora. This is very similar. It reminded me what Jeff Kopstein said 2 days ago, that this is certainly not an asset for any political scientist to work on the Holocaust or in Jewish studies, rather than general problems like democratic transition, which has a global application. So, but as we see, you can ask very important questions of political science or sociology, dealing with Polish Jewish history. And maybe we have had such an interest of students in certain aspects of Jewish studies, such as Holocaust, because Holocaust certainly makes part of Jewish history, especially in Poland, but not only of Jewish history, because we have had these great debates. And, looking back into the late 1980s, when I decided to write my dissertation on a topic from Polish Jewish studies, on Ignacy Schwarzbard, was it correlated with my rebellious nature of a young rebellious student? Maybe we will attract this kind of people also now. People who are contrarians, who are rebellious, who are, this way marginal. I'm not sure. But usually academia consists of rather extravagant individuals, so that may be not necessarily bad. So I see three answers. One is solidarity first. It always works. Second is to maintain and build institutional structures which require funding. And here Geneviève is right. Money is necessary almost always, not always, but money is useful. And third, to not only to allow, but to facilitate cooperation across borders, especially for young people, to let them see what their peers think and talk about in Israel or in North America? Thank you.
Well, I think I really need slowly to wrap up. There was one question which we didn't have time to look at, which was put by Edward Weisband. Why were Jewish literary studies so scantily presented? Clearly, this was a gap and we should have filled this. But I think that what this three presenters have pointed out, the importance of solidarity, the importance of continuing these discussions, the importance of this form of history in creating and developing a civil society remains with us. It's very encouraging that so many people were involved in this conference. I mean, at least 500. I think that in this sense, I do believe there is a reverse Gresham's law in historical scholarship, that good history and good social anthropology have not as, I mean, this has been widely used as a tool. Tokarska Bakir is a good example in Poland, do drive out in the long run bad scholarship. And this will, I hope, create some degree of dialogue. One of the problems of the present situation is the absence of any dialogue. I was a student in Poland in the 1960s, and after I became disillusioned with communism, people would tell me, this is a person that you can't shake hands with. A situation where there are people you can't shake hands with is not a good situation. And we've got back to that situation, and we need to try and get out of it. And the way that we're going to get out of it is by showing that we are actually pursuing a scholarly agenda. We don't have a political agenda. We are trying to discover what actually happened. Wie es eigentlich gewesen, as Ranke often derided, said, and this still retains an important message for us today. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank the three panelists for their very interesting and well-considered observations. I'd like to thank everybody who participated in this event. I'd like to think that we can build on this to create the community and the solidarity which Dariusz talked about, and that we can advance the understanding of the history of Polish Jewish past and the history of Poland itself, without which the Polish Jewish past is an essential and necessary part, as Moshe Rossman has pointed out. And I'd like with those thoughts, to close this very impressive, successful, and moving conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks to everyone else.